It began not in a palace chamber, but inside a sealed trust meeting room where Diana's estate archivists finally broke decades of silence. When the trustees confirmed that Princess Diana's private letters had been legally transferred into a safeguarded line of inheritance for Prince George, the reaction was instant shock. Prince William reportedly froze, unable to speak, because what was meant to remain sealed until a future reign had already been moved. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Inside that tightly controlled trustees gathering, every word carried the weight of history. This was not a casual briefing, nor a routine update to Diana's literary estate. It was a formal confirmation that a private letter corpus, a carefully preserved collection of Princess Diana's most personal writings, reflections, and unsent communications, had been reassigned within a protected inheritance structure. Reports suggest the adjustment had been made quietly in early 2026, buried within legal amendments that only a handful of estate guardians were fully briefed on. Nothing about it was presented as dramatic on paper, yet the emotional impact inside the room was anything but controlled. The moment the implication became clear that Prince George was now positioned as a future custodian of these deeply private materials, the atmosphere reportedly shifted into stunned silence. William, according to insiders familiar with the exchange, did not react immediately. The weight of what he was hearing appeared to settle in layers rather than at once. Catherine, standing beside him, is said to have remained composed outwardly, but subtly intervened in the conversation to steady the tone, urging calm as legal explanations continued. Yet calm was difficult to sustain when the subject at hand was not just inheritance, but memory itself, his mother's most intimate written legacy, now placed on a trajectory that bypassed expected generational timing. Palace aides, sensing the sensitivity of what had just been disclosed, began to prepare for the meeting. Were reportedly instructed to maintain absolute silence, with even internal communications reduced to minimal phrasing. What made the moment more unsettling was not only the legal confirmation, but the emotional recalibration it demanded. George, still years away from any formal constitutional role, was now symbolically tied to a body of work that carried Diana's voice in its most unfiltered form. Insiders whisper that trustees framed the decision as legacy continuity, but within royal circles it landed differently as a shift in emotional ownership that no one had publicly debated. For William, the implication was quietly devastating. A mother's private words, once imagined as carefully shielded until a distant future, were already moving forward without his direct consent. And yet, beneath the shock of timing and authority, a deeper question began to form in the background of the discussion, one that no trustee could easily answer aloud. But the real shock wasn't the transfer itself, it was why Diana's letters were never meant to reach George this early. Behind locked archival doors at Kensington Palace lies one of the most sensitive private collections in royal history, Princess Diana's unsent letters, personal reflections, and handwritten notes. Long believed to be sealed until George reached maturity, the trust governing them was built under strict instructions. Yet insiders now suggest the archive was far more powerful than anyone publicly admitted, containing emotional, political, and deeply personal revelations about the monarchy itself. Inside these protected layers of royal custody, Diana's writings are not treated as ordinary correspondence. Since 1997, they have been held under a tightly constructed literary trust, designed to preserve both privacy and historical integrity while shielding the contents from premature exposure. Legal frameworks tied to royal estate governance and privacy law reinforce that structure, ensuring that access would remain restricted until Prince George reached adulthood, a safeguard intended to prevent emotional or constitutional disruption. On paper, it appeared simple. In reality, it was anything but. Those familiar with the arrangement describe it as an unusually fortified archive, one where trustees operate under dual obligation: legal duty on one side and emotional restraint on the other. The trustees themselves include a blend of royal legal advisors and independent estate managers, selected precisely to prevent any single branch of influence from shaping interpretation or timing. Over the years, The archive has been spoken of in controlled language. Emotionally sensitive royal material, a phrase that barely captures the weight attributed to its contents. Because this is not merely about memory preservation, it is about a voice that once sat at the center of the monarchy's most turbulent modern chapter, now preserved in silence. Insiders suggest the letters contain far more than personal sentiment. They are said to include reflections on the pressure of royal life, the suffocating weight of public expectation, and the fractures that define private relationships behind palace walls. Nothing in these writings has ever been officially released, yet their mere existence has always shaped quiet decision-making within the institution. For those tasked with safeguarding them, the responsibility is not just archival, it is reputational, emotional, and historically irreversible. Security around the collection reflects that reality. Comparable in classification to the handling of crown jewels documentation, access protocols are layered, deliberate, and intentionally slow-moving. Even internal references are limited, often reduced to coded acknowledgments rather than explicit discussion. Every detail of storage, review, and potential future release has been engineered to prevent sudden disruption. Because once such material moves into the public or semi-public sphere, it does not simply inform history, it reshapes it. Yet beneath this carefully maintained structure, a subtle tension has always existed. The original intent was clear: protect Diana's words until the next generation was fully prepared to inherit not just a title, but the emotional complexity attached to it. But institutions rarely remain static, especially when legal guardianship intersects with evolving interpretations of legacy. And as time progressed, small procedural shifts began to emerge, barely visible on the surface, but significant within the legal machinery that governed the archive. However, a quiet legal adjustment years in the making would quietly begin rewriting Diana's legacy. Sources suggest that in early 2026, a subtle amendment was made to the Diana Literary Trust, an adjustment so minor on paper it nearly escaped notice. But within legal circles, it represented a seismic shift. Prince George was quietly added as a future primary beneficiary of Diana's personal correspondence. What appeared procedural on the surface carried emotional weight that no one in the royal household fully anticipated. Inside the quiet machinery of royal legal administration, this was not framed as a dramatic change. It was presented as refinement, a technical evolution of a long-standing structure designed to protect Princess Diana's written legacy. Yet beneath that, calm legal language, a far more consequential transition was unfolding. The trust, once defined by its rigid promise of sealed generational preservation, was beginning to transform into something subtly different: an early legacy transmission system, where emotional inheritance was no longer locked to distant timelines, but gradually introduced into the next generation's future. And at the center of this shift stood Prince George, positioned not merely as a descendant, but as a symbolic custodian of writings that carried the emotional weight of the modern monarchy itself. Insiders familiar with the review process suggest the amendment was executed through routine estate procedures, the kind that rarely draw attention beyond legal oversight committees. But the implications were anything but routine. By quietly repositioning George within the structure, the trust was no longer just preserving Diana's voice, it was actively redirecting its trajectory. Within internal discussions, some trustees reportedly saw this as a necessary modernization, a way to ensure continuity between memory and monarchy. Others, however, viewed it as a premature exposure of emotional material that had always been intended to remain distant, carefully buffered from the pressures of royal duty. The tension between these interpretations quickly became evident. The trustees were no longer aligned on timing or sensitivity. Some argued that George's symbolic inclusion strengthened the monarchy's narrative of continuity, anchoring Diana's legacy firmly within the future line of succession. Others feared it blurred boundaries that had been intentionally preserved since 1997, when the archive was first sealed under strict instruction. What had once been an unquestioned structure of protection was now becoming a contested space of interpretation, where every decision carried emotional consequences as much as legal ones. At Buckingham Palace, awareness of the amendment reportedly arrived in stages, 3. Filtered through legal briefings rather than direct disclosure. William, according to insiders, was not part of the initial decision-making loop and only learned of the final confirmation after the legal adjustment had already been formalized. The reaction within his circle was described as restrained but deeply unsettled, a realization that a personal and maternal legacy had been repositioned without his prior engagement. Catherine, typically composed in moments of institutional strain, is said to have been visibly disturbed by the broader implications, recognizing not just the legal shift, but the emotional ripple it would create within the family's internal balance. As the news filtered upward, Buckingham Palace legal advisors began their own internal review, not to reverse the decision, but to fully understand its scope and potential consequences. The focus was no longer on whether the amendment was valid, but on what it meant for the future narrative surrounding Diana's writings, George's symbolic association with them. Every layer of the institution seemed to adjust in response, recalibrating language, access protocols, and internal messaging to contain the widening interpretation of what had just changed. And yet, beneath all the procedural containment and careful phrasing, one reality stood unchallenged. Something deeply personal had been repositioned within the architecture of the monarchy, altering not just legal structure, but emotional alignment across generations. But this was not a simple legal update, it was the beginning of a deeply personal royal fracture. When Prince William was finally briefed on the trust decision, insiders describe a moment of absolute silence. No immediate reaction. No response. Just stillness. The future king, long accustomed to controlling royal continuity, was now facing a decision that had already been made without him. And worse, his mother's most intimate written legacy was now linked directly to his son's future. Identity. The briefing itself, according to those familiar with its timing, was delivered in a controlled, procedural manner, almost clinical in tone. There was no attempt to soften the implications, because legally none were required. The decision had already passed through trustee confirmation, sealed within estate governance channels, and only then was it elevated to William's awareness. That delay, however standard in administrative terms, carried emotional weight that could not be ignored. It created a gap between decision and consent, between legacy and leadership, and within that gap, silence settled heavily. Those close to the situation describe William's reaction not as visible disruption, but as internal compression. A quiet containment of emotion that did not translate into words. Diana's presence in his life has always carried dual-meaning personal grief and public symbolism. But this development intensified both at once. It was no longer just about memory preservation, it was about narrative direction. The idea that George would now be symbolically connected to Diana's private writings reframed the past into something actively projected onto the future, reshaping how legacy itself was being interpreted inside the institution. Catherine, positioned beside him through this unfolding strain, reportedly became an essential stabilizing force. While she did not challenge the facts of the briefing, insiders suggest her focus shifted immediately to containment of emotional escalation. Her support was not performative, it was structural, helping maintain equilibrium in a moment where personal history and institutional expectation collided. Within the household, her presence was seen as the quiet counterweight to an otherwise destabilizing revelation. As the hours passed, palace aides began to notice a subtle but unmistakable change in William's demeanor. Not outward crisis, but withdrawal, a reduction in visibility. Fewer engagements, shorter exchanges. The kind of silence that often signals deeper processing rather than absence. Internally, this was noted with concern, not because of unpredictability, but because of what it implied, that the decision had reached a layer of emotional impact beyond routine royal governance. At the same time, the communications environment surrounding the palace began to tighten. While no official statements were issued, awareness of potential media interpretation began shaping internal caution. Any mention of Diana in relation to inheritance or George's future identity carried immediate sensitivity, and the risk of narrative distortion was understood at senior levels. What might have remained a contained legal adjustment was now a matter of public perception waiting to form. And yet, even with all this careful management, one question refused to settle. It lingered beneath the structure of protocol, beneath the language of trusteeship and inheritance, beneath even William's silence. Because, no matter how carefully the decision was framed, its emotional consequence pointed toward something far more complex than procedure. Yet the most difficult question was not William's reaction, but why Diana's legacy was being redirected at all. Prince George, still young and largely shielded from constitutional responsibility, suddenly finds himself symbolically connected to one of the most emotionally charged archives in royal history. Trustees reportedly framed the decision as legacy continuity, but within palace circles it sparked a more uncomfortable interpretation. Diana's voice was now being positioned as part of George's future royal identity. The framing of the decision was carefully chosen, almost deliberately softened to avoid immediate alarm. Generational emotional preservation, as it was described in internal discussions, suggested continuity rather than disruption, a bridge between past and future rather than a rupture in protocol. Yet beneath that language lay a far more delicate reality. This was not simply about safeguarding historical documents, it was about assigning emotional inheritance to a child who has not yet stepped into constitutional duty. And within that distinction, tension quietly began to build. For some within the trustee structure, the logic was clear. Diana's correspondence, long treated as a sealed emotional archive, would eventually need a living connection, someone within the direct line of succession, to carry its symbolic weight into the future. George, as the next generation, naturally became that focal point. But for others, the timing felt unsettling. Not because of legality, but because of psychology. Exposure, even symbolic exposure, carries consequences that cannot be reversed once introduced into the narrative of royal identity. Catherine, according to insiders, is said to have approached the development with visible concern. Her perspective reportedly centered not on institutional symbolism, but on emotional impact. The idea that her son could grow up orbiting a legacy defined by such deeply personal material raised questions about balance, maturity, and emotional framing. It was not opposition in the formal sense, but hesitation grounded in protection and instinct shaped by lived proximity to public pressure and constant scrutiny. William's position, meanwhile, became increasingly complex. As both father and heir, he was caught between two interpretations of responsibility. As a parent, the instinct to shield and delay was natural. As a future sovereign, the expectation of continuity and acceptance of institutional decisions carried equal weight. Those around him described not confrontation, but internal conflict, a quiet tension between personal instinct and structural obligation, neither side fully resolving the other. Within legal advisory circles, the emphasis remained on structure and containment. Access to Diana's letters, they stressed, would remain strictly non-public, carefully controlled, governed by layered permissions. The intention, at least on paper, was not exposure but stewardship. Yet even controlled access does not erase emotional consequence. It only delays its encounter. And that delay, while administratively necessary, did little to ease the underlying concern that perception would eventually catch up with policy. At the same time, within the communications apparatus of the palace, quiet preparations began. Not in response to immediate crisis, but in anticipation of interpretation. Because once the idea of George being linked to Diana's writings entered public imagination, it would no longer remain an internal matter. It would become narrative, shaped outside the palace walls, reframed through speculation and emotional reading. Messaging strategies were therefore adjusted preemptively, focusing on continuity, legacy, and protection, rather than detail or disclosure. And yet, despite all layers of framing, procedure, and reassurance, something deeper was beginning to shift beneath the surface. Because the language of inheritance had introduced a new emotional geometry into the royal structure, one where memory, identity, and future expectation were beginning to overlap in ways that no document alone could fully contain. But behind the language of legacy continuity, deeper tensions inside the institution began to surface. Within the trustee board itself, disagreement reportedly emerged over timing, transparency, and emotional risk. Some view the decision as a respectful evolution of Diana's legacy. Others believed it risked politicizing deeply private correspondence. The divide was no longer legal, it was philosophical. Who truly owns Diana's voice? The institution, her children, or the future heir? What began as a structured governance process slowly transformed into something far more unsettled. Trustees, once aligned by procedural clarity, now found themselves navigating a question that had no clean legal resolution. On one side, stood the argument for continuity, preserving Diana's writings within the framework of royal stewardship, ensuring they remained part of the institution's historical fabric. On the other side stood caution, the belief that emotional material of this depth should not be repositioned too quickly, especially when it intersects so directly with living members of the royal family. The debate over privacy versus historical transparency became increasingly sharp. For some, opening the pathway of interpretation, even in a controlled, symbolic sense, risked altering the meaning of Diana's voice. Her words, preserved in isolation for decades, carried weight precisely because they were untouched by evolving institutional narratives. To reassign access or symbolic ownership too early, they argued, could unintentionally reshape how future generations interpret both her life and her relationship with the monarchy. Legal advisors attempted to steady the conversation by reinforcing controlled access protocols. Their position remained consistent. Whatever symbolic changes were being considered, the structural safeguards would remain intact. No public exposure, no unrestricted release, only carefully tiered access governed by strict oversight. But even these assurances could not fully neutralize the underlying tension, because the issue was no longer about exposure alone, it was about emotional sequencing, about when identity becomes attached to legacy. As discussions deepened, institutional reputation began to weigh more heavily in the background. Every interpretation of the trust carried potential ripple effects beyond legal boundaries. The monarchy's relationship with Diana's memory has always been uniquely sensitive, shaped by decades of public emotion and private restraint. Any perceived shift in how her legacy was handled risked reopening long-standing scrutiny, and trustees were acutely aware that even internal disagreement could eventually surface externally. Reports of internal memo circulation, unofficial summaries of divergent trustee opinions only intensified concern within palace corridors. Even without formal leaks, the mere possibility that differing interpretations existed created unease. Because once internal complexity becomes visible, even indirectly, it invites external narrative construction. And in an environment where symbolism carries as much weight as law, perception can quickly become its own form of pressure. Amid this growing strain, the contrast between duty and sensitivity became increasingly difficult to maintain. Trustees were not merely managing documents, they were managing memory, identity, and expectation all at once. Each position taken seemed to pull the archive in a slightly different direction, either toward institutional permanence or toward emotional caution. Neither path was fully wrong, yet neither could fully resolve the tension now embedded in the decision. And as trustees argued over principle, the monarchy itself began preparing for fallout control. Following the disclosure, Buckingham Palace entered what insiders describe as a containment phase. No official statements were issued, but internal communications tightened rapidly. The goal was clear: prevent emotional interpretation of a legal archival decision from becoming a public narrative about royal division. But silence, in this case, only deepened speculation. Inside the palace machinery, containment was not treated as absence of communication, but as precision control. Every message, every response, every absence of comment became part of a carefully managed structure designed to prevent escalation. The decision surrounding Diana's letters had already taken on emotional weight within internal circles, and the immediate priority shifted toward ensuring that weight did not spill outward into public interpretation. What made the situation more delicate was not the legal framework itself, but the emotional associations. Attached to it, associations that could not be easily contained once released into public awareness. A strict media silence strategy was quickly adopted, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a calculated protective measure. Internal briefing notes circulated among senior aides emphasized consistency above explanation, clarity above detail. The language used in these notes was deliberately neutral, avoiding any phrasing that could invite emotional framing. Even small variations in wording were scrutinized because in moments of heightened sensitivity, tone itself becomes a form of messaging. Attention within the palace shifted immediately toward William and George, not as symbolic figures in a broader narrative, but as individuals positioned at the emotional center of interpretation. The priority, according to insiders, was to shield them from external speculation before it could solidify into public expectation. Catherine, in particular, was described as a stabilizing presence during this period, quietly reinforcing composure within the household and ensuring that internal tension did not translate into visible disruption. Her role, though understated, became increasingly important as the situation evolved. At the same time, press inquiries began arriving with greater frequency, each one probing for clarity, interpretation, or confirmation. The responses, however, remained firmly anchored in neutral legal framing. No emotional language, no expansion of context, only procedural acknowledgement where necessary. This approach was intentional. The aim was not to engage with narrative development, but to prevent it from forming in the first place. Yet even this restraint carried consequences, as silence itself began to attract attention. Within communication teams, there was a growing awareness that Diana's name carries a unique form of public sensitivity, one that transcends institutional messaging. Any reference to her legacy, particularly in relation to family, inheritance, or future generations, has historically triggered heightened emotional response. That awareness resurfaced sharply now, shaping every layer of response strategy. The challenge was no longer just managing information, but managing interpretation before it solidified into public narrative. As monitoring of external discourse intensified, teams tracked emerging speculation with caution. Not to engage, but to understand how quickly the story could evolve beyond its factual boundaries. Because once emotional framing begins externally, it rarely remains contained within institutional explanation. It develops its own momentum, shaped by perception rather than procedure. Yet even as containment efforts strengthened, an underlying truth remained unchanged beneath all internal coordination and silence. Yet containment could not change the underlying reality. Diana's words had already crossed a generational threshold. In the end, the trustees' decision was not about paperwork, nor protocol, nor even legality. It was about legacy. Princess Diana's private letters, once sealed in silence, now sit on a path toward Prince George, reshaping how the next generation of the monarchy may one day understand her. For William, it is both a gift and a wound. A mother's voice preserved, yet no longer solely his to protect. What unfolded was never simply a matter of administration. It became a quiet redirection of memory itself, where the past was no longer locked away in archival stillness, but carefully positioned toward the future line of succession. Diana's words, once held in protective isolation, are now woven into a generational framework that ensures they will not remain frozen in time. Instead, they will move slowly, deliberately into the emotional landscape of Prince George's future understanding of what the monarchy is and what it has endured. For William, that shift carries a weight that cannot be measured in legal language. It is the collision of two identities he has carried for decades. The grieving son who guards his mother's memory, and the future king who must accept that personal boundaries often dissolve beneath institutional continuity. There is no clear resolution in that conflict, only adjustment, because the monarchy does not pause for emotional alignment. It continues forward even when its most personal histories are being quietly repositioned within it. George's role within this evolving structure is not defined by authority, but by symbolism. He becomes, whether intentionally or not, a future emotional heir to a voice that shaped public understanding of the royal family in ways no institution could fully control. It is not inheritance in the traditional sense of property or title. It is inheritance of perspective, of narrative, of memory filtered through the most intimate form of correspondence Diana ever created. The trust itself is framed as a long-term preservation mechanism, designed to protect both dignity, context, yet preservation is never neutral. It always involves selection, timing, and interpretation. And in that careful balancing act, the meaning of Diana's words is no longer fixed to the past. It is being gently guided toward a future reader who has yet to fully understand their weight. That reality introduces a subtle but undeniable shift in how legacy operates within the royal framework. Throughout it all, Catherine remains a stabilizing presence, anchoring emotional turbulence with quiet steadiness. Her role is not defined by the legal structure of the trust, but by the human reality it creates inside the household. She stands within the intersection of memory and responsibility, helping maintain equilibrium as the implications of the decision continue to settle. In a system built on tradition, her influence is felt in the preservation of balance when everything else begins to shift. And within the broader institution, something more subtle begins to take shape. The monarchy's narrative of legacy is no longer purely retrospective. It is becoming forward-facing, shaped not only by what is preserved, but by who is chosen to receive it. That shift does not announce itself loudly. It emerges quietly, through adjustments in trust language, in advisory phrasing, in generational positioning. Yet its impact is unmistakable. At its core, this moment leaves behind a tension that cannot be easily resolved. Memory versus duty. Private grief versus public responsibility. Personal. Inheritance versus institutional direction. Each exists simultaneously, pulling in different directions, yet bound together by the same unseen thread of continuity. And in that quiet transfer of ink and memory, the monarchy once again finds itself shaped not by crowns or coronations, but by the words left behind. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.